So thank you everyone for joining us today. We're talking about how the data, national accounts data, integrates into the Sustainable Development Simulator. Just a quick agenda for today. We have an introduction from me around just the Millennium Institute. What is the Sustainable Development Simulator? And talking a little bit about data calibration. It's Igor's part. And then we're going in depth in the simulator, learning a little bit on more details on how the data is inputted into the simulator and how that generates the different scenarios and how we can simulate policy in there. If you don't know me, I'm Fernando. I'm policy analyst and also the communications lead for the Millennium Institute. And we also have Igor Oliveira here. He's also a policy analyst and our business development lead. So thank you so much for joining. So if you don't know the Millennium Institute, we are a non-profit organization. We were founded over 40 years ago in 1983. We specialize in policy impact simulation, and we design these data-driven strategies for sustainability transitions. We mostly work with government leadership in other institutions to basically help them figure out what is the best path for a sustainable future. And we are very committed to educate these decision makers in systems thinking and advance the sustainable development goals. We have experience in over 40 countries. We have mostly worked in the developing world. And you see in this map that we do have some experience in Africa, but also Latin America, in South Asia, and also in Europe. So today we're talking about the Sustainable Simulator. And if you want to learn how this works and how it's separated between the different domains, we will dig a little bit deeper today. So just to give you an overview, the simulator has hundreds of indicators. It's based in system dynamics model, so you can simulate with real world data, and you can basically test the different development scenarios and long-term impact of different policies. The model has over 30 sectors, depending on the version that you are working with. And it's always split between the three different domains. You see the social, economic, and environmental here. You can see a few of the sectors here, just to give an example. In the social, and you have governance, finance, and you also have the economic part, you have the education, mortality, and then finally the environmental part, where we have material consumption, emissions, biodiversity, energy consumption. The Sustainable Development Simulator includes different sustainable development frameworks. The most common one that we use is the Sustainable Development Goals, the SDGs, but we also have the donut economics and also the planetary boundaries. So depending on the client's desire, we can adapt to have these different frameworks. I'm just gonna give you an overview of how a typical project with the Millennium Institute plays out, the timeline. We start with stakeholders consultations, basically just talking with the stakeholders to identify the challenges, ensuring that the model reflects this unique needs of each system in each country. And then we do some data integration. This is a long part of the process as well. We gather information from sources like FAO, the World Bank, and also the national accounts. We're gonna talk about this very soon to create this accurate scenario specific to your country's context. And then we run some scenario analysis with the different ideas and different requirements for specific client. And we see this, how the policies interact with the Sustainable Development Goals and how this reveals some synergies and trade-offs. And then finally, we do some strategic recommendations based on this policy scenario analysis, translating the policy into actionable recommendations. Throughout this whole timeline, these 4 steps that I just presented, we focus on training. Also, the group that works with us, the government usually appoints a technical team to work with us, where we go through training process. So the team learns how to use the model once the Millennium Institute is not there to work with the team. The team develops these skills to work with the simulator by themselves and eventually study the policies by themselves and influence decision making. We have a lot of success stories. Recently, we're going to also have take a look in the green hydrogen project, where we evaluated the impact of a green hydrogen sector in the SDGs in Brazil, Namibia, and South Africa. We also have examples where we applied the Sustainable Development Simulator to for integrated policy analysis for the air pollution challenge in Thailand and Laos, and also livelihood improvement for the indigenous people in Australia. And one recent contribution of the simulator is that Transforming Australia SDG Progress Report that has been recently released. And the simulator was used by the Monash University from Australia to tackle inequality in the country. And the ISD simulator revealed the pathway to halve poverty in Australia by 2050. I'm going to soon put a link here in the chat so you can check this out. You can download the report and also see the results of these simulations that we helped the Monash University conclude. And I think that's all from my side. I'm also going to be here helping out with some questions. If you have any questions, you can put in the chat. Also, I will have one Q&A session by the end of this WeGo's presentation. Igor, that's all from my side. I can skip past the slides if you want to.
Right. So let's take a closer look at the data aspect today, and particularly using the Brazil case as an example. As Fernando said, my name is Igor. I lead partnership development at the Millennium Institute, but have also worked as a policy analyst in quite a few projects, including this one in Brazil. So let's get to the next slide, and then first, let's just take a look at the key features that make our modeling framework and our simulator quite unique, right? So it is a type of simulation model that is able to compute trade-offs and synergies across policy areas and policy options and policy portfolios, right? So it's quite really transversal in the sense that it connects different domains that usually are analyzed in separation, right? And to be able to do that, we need to represent established theory in each of these domains and also on the linkages between them. The model is parameterized and calibrated using standard data sources in all of these domains. We use these international, like consolidated international sources for each of these things, but today I want to focus a little bit on national accounts, which is a key piece of data that we use and that usually follows IMF standards, although the data for every country is not available in the same way in the IMF data platform. And that's part of the challenge that I'm going to explain a little bit today in this presentation. Yeah, next. So first, it's important to show a little bit this landscape, this bird's eye view of how data is used in this modeling approach and this modeling framework, which is a bit different perhaps from other types of models that you have experienced. We follow the system dynamics tradition, which is not, by definition, a data-driven type of modeling. It's a structure-driven type of modeling in the sense that we have the best possible representations of the world, and we do that by integrating established theory into our model. And that's what primarily generates the results. Then we use data to calibrate the model, meaning that we use data to adjust the model to a specific reality of a specific country, right? And then that's how we manage to deliver scenario analysis that are specific to that country. So in what comes to the first use of data in our modeling framework, this is basically qualitative data, which is theory that is in different domains, in different bodies of literature, and that we incorporate to our modeling via a model governance that we have, that we try to only incorporate things that are really, really established in each domain, and mathematical formulations that are also quite established in these domains. Apart from that, we have some global parameters that are common to many countries that are also part of the, let's say, the template model. And we try to use generic structures as much as possible so that people can relate to mathematical formulations and representations that they already know and that they're already validated in each of these domains, right? So in the next slide, what you see is a screenshot of our model documentation where we explain these structural assumptions in each of these different sectors and how we incorporate the different pieces of theory together and how we connect them to each other. There is an update now ongoing for this because we have a quite significant change in the model that happened in the end of last year. So we expect to have a completely new documentation by May, and it will be, we hope, even more transparent and clear compared to this one. Right now, what we have is kind of a wiki format in which you can navigate and see the different assumptions, so on and so forth. So that's for the first block, let's say the first use of data, which is in the template model. Now in the next slide, let's talk a little bit about the use of, can come back a little. Yeah, thank you. Just to introduce a little bit the use of data for calibration, right? So again, that's a bit different from other modeling frameworks that perhaps you have experienced. System dynamics models, they are not data models. They're not input-output models, meaning that the garbage in, garbage out logic doesn't fully apply to us because we have a lot of structure in the model. And this structure is what mostly defines or determines the behavior of the systems that we are modeling. Our models are not so dependent on data. Still, it's very important to have the best possible calibration data sets to make sure that the idiosyncratic representation of each country that we undertake with our modeling framework is as accurate as possible, right? So for that, we mostly use data that is available in international data platforms, including in the case of national accounts, we use the IMF data platform, right? But in some cases, it's necessary because there are holes in this international sources, or because the country really wants to use another source of data, and then it's necessary to use national data. So let's take a look in the next slide a little bit more on what it really means on this calibration. So we have our own process that is based on standard best practice that has been created by the system dynamics community. I would say, system dynamics as a method has 60 something years, but this particular field has grown a lot since the early 2000s, which is model testing and model calibration as a validation strategy for system dynamics models. So we follow some of these best practices, and we develop our own calibration process, which is a bit more detailed in the next slide. Yes, which it's basically something consolidated by authors like Rogério Oliva and Yaman Barlas. They, throughout the years, they iterated this process. Nowadays, it's the mainstream process to calibrate this type of big system dynamics model. So we first calibrate each of the sectors in isolation. Yeah, no worries.
Sorry, let me just
no problem. Then
here.
Yes. Oh, it looks much better. So we first calibrate each sector in isolation. Then we slowly integrate the sectors together in a specific order, which in our case goes from the sectors that have less endogeneity to the sectors that have more endogeneity in the model. It's a safer way to do this type of calibration. So we always keep track of the levels of error and bias and how this error and bias is distributed across the different sectors of the model, and even within the sectors to understand exactly what parts of the model structure need more effort in terms of improving the calibration, or where a data gap might be undermining the calibration, or perhaps there is an ontological problem, a phenomenon that is very specific to that country and that is not well represented in the general ontology of the model and the data that we use, right? So we are always, throughout this calibration process, paying attention to this aspect. Yes, in the next slide. Yes, we see an example of this tracking of error and bias. And this is a screenshot from an actual report that we delivered to our national partners, right? So we show not only in aggregate terms the level of fit that the model has to the data, and decomposing also in different types of error that exist in the model, but also we show it per sector and even per variable. This is one example of the calibration for private savings, right, in a country. And then we can see that the green line there is what our model produces synthetically. It's a simulation. And the blue line is the data, right? So we can see the fit, and the client can also, our national partners, they can also read through this and understand in which areas the model is stronger or weaker for that specific country that is being modeled, right? Yes. So let's take a look a little bit more specifically into the Brazil application of the model in the context of green hydrogen. So this project, we did national models for Brazil, South Africa, and Namibia. We ran the complete modeling process, but it was focused on a specific aspect, which is the development of green hydrogen economy, right, in these three countries, and the synergies and trade-offs that it creates in terms of sustainable development pathways for these three countries. So let's look a little bit closer into the case of Brazil and the use of data for that case.
Igor, just before we dig into the results here of this project, I just wanted to share the poll's results here in, I'm not seeing if you can see this.
I can, yeah.
Yeah, so we see that most people joining us today is the first time learning about the simulator. And we also have some people who have some previous experience in the simulator. So thank you for the both kind of audience that are joining us today. I think this is insightful for both who already learned about the simulator and people who already, and people that first time learning about it. So thank you so much for joining us. I just wanted to brief you about this, Igor, just to adapt your for those first time learning about the simulator.
It's true. It's true. I tend to, I'm more used to talking to other profiles. So I might have a bit of a bias in the way I speak. Yeah, I'll try to be more clear. Let's get to the next slide and take a look at the overview of this project. So although the project was focused on green hydrogen, as I mentioned, we did assess, simulate the performance of each SDG over time for each of the 3 countries, and then analyze the contribution, or in some cases the trade-offs that are created by the development of the green hydrogen sector in terms of SDG performance, right? So when an intervention like this, like the funding of a whole new economic sector in a country takes place, that there might be some unexpected results arising from that, right? And that's what we try to analyze with the type of model that we develop at Millennium Institute. We try to understand exactly what those trade-offs are and what opportunities it creates for the country to maximize its performance across all SDGs, right? So that's in a nutshell what we do and what we did with this project. Let's go to the next. So for this particular project, we were looking at 3 different scenarios, right? So we had a ramp-up scenario, which considered only the investments that are already announced or made public in the 3 countries in terms of green hydrogen, right? Then we had a stronger ramp-up scenario, which doubled this assumption in terms of the announced investments and introduced 2 different types of tax breaks to green hydrogen. I also introduced a carbon taxation in the country. So we were simulating these 3 policy assumptions in this scenario to see what would happen then in terms of overall SDG performance, right? Then we had a 3rd scenario that was like the one in the middle, but assuming also higher price for the fossil fuels, which favors green hydrogen, right? Because green hydrogen is the hydrogen that is produced from renewable sources, basically. So it helps green hydrogen become more competitive in comparison to its substitutes. So those were the 3 scenarios. Let's take a look at the next slide. And in terms of, so getting back to the data conversation. So here's a list of data sources that we used in this particular implementation of the simulator, and I put in bold the ones that take most of our time and cleaning the data and making it ready to be introduced or inputted into the model, right? So the IEA data, because it's a huge data set about energy, that we have to integrate into the model. And energy is quite a complex accounting system on itself, right? I don't know if people in the audience have experience with energy accounting, but it's really, really a complex matter on itself. Only the accounting, only counting what has been happening in an energy system of a country is already a very complicated task. Imagine simulating what could happen if this or that assumptions are in place, right? So that's quite a complex undertaking, and we had to complement it with national data sources in this case. So we used data from the national system operator in Brazil, from the National Oil Agency. So we had to complement it with a few national sources because there were gaps in this in this domain of energy. And finally, national accounts data, right? So we, of course, use IMF data directly, but this is always or often room for some controversy in the countries we work in, because the way IMF standardizes the accounts when they're uploaded to their data platform is subject to interpretation, right? And so we had to complement it with data that we got from Excel sheets directly from Treasury in Brazil. And these Excel sheets were quite complex on their own. I think there is a screenshot, one of the next slides. Yes, here they are. So trouble with this type of Excel sheet. Well, first of all, Brazil is a 3-level federation, right? So you have municipal, state, and central government. And often the data you find that people often treat as national is actually central government data. But this is, of course, wrong, right? You don't, this is only the accounting of the central government itself. It's not the national accounting. The national accounting has to account for the 3 levels at the same time, right? So that's one of the mistakes that people do. And when calibrating simulation models, it's very important that we do this transformation appropriately, because otherwise the impacts that we will be simulating of a given policy won't be realistic, right? Because, for instance, when we calibrate a unit cost, right? We calibrate it with past data, right? So we look at the whole history of, let's say, investment in health in Brazil, and then we see certain consequences of that investment. If we calibrate it only with central government data, it will seem like investing in health in Brazil is easier than it actually is, right? Because the expenses were this small to generate all of these results, right? Well, that's because you don't have the full expenses there, right? Because some of these expenses are actually in the budgets of states and municipalities, right? So you have to carefully look at this 3-level governance to be able to simulate these things adequately. And the thing is, when you have holes in the IMF accounting and you want to really dig into national data like we did here, and the spreadsheet in the back, the blue one, is actually about debt. The one on top, the white one, is about expenditure. So when we do that, we see all sorts of data formats, right? We see, for instance, in this case, each year was a spreadsheet, was a different file, actually, not a different spreadsheet in the same file. So each year was a different file, right? And then for each year, you have also the previous 2 years, but they don't match. If you look, because there are reviews, methodological reviews, and there are corrections that are made. So if you look at the 2007 spreadsheet, it also has 2006 and 2005. But if you open 2008, which also has 2006, you see that the two 2060s are different, right? So you have to understand what they did there and why they're different. And understand if the methodological difference also affects the current year or not. And all this data treatment that has to be done before we even start feeding the model with data, right? So untangling all of this complexity is a task that normally stays with our data team. In this case, because I did it myself, I have the memory, and I can recall it was a real adventure going through all of these spreadsheets. And So yeah, this is treasury data from Brazil, downloaded directly from their website, and it helped us understand expenditure and the structure of the Brazilian public debt. So in summary, but it's a big adventure, I can assure. Let's go to the next slide, Fernando. Thank you. So yeah, you can see that all of that complexity, all of that complicated data sets that we employ, in the end of the project, they look very simple when you guys use our interface, right? And you simulate different scenarios with policies here and there. Yes, but before that, there are a few steps, right? So we, as I mentioned before, we have a template model that is carefully developed over the years to represent the best available theory. Then we have all of these complicated data sets that are then summarized into a relatively simple Excel file that only has 1,500 rows. Okay, so we're talking about 1,500 variables that are then fed into the model. This model is then calibrated using the best available practice to calibrate a huge simulation model that represents the development of an entire country. And then when this calibration is finally at the right level of quality, then that's when we start simulating scenarios. Some of these scenarios are already available in the interface that we provide to the countries, but our interface goes beyond that. It allows the user to create their own scenarios based on policy mixes that they find interesting, right? Or that are meaningful to the political debate of that country at that particular moment. So it's really, when you see this, it seems easy, perhaps when you see the interface, but there's a whole chain of things that need to go well before we get there. Yeah, let's go to the next slide, Fernando. Yeah, so again, from the template model, the data collection, the calibration, and then the scenarios that are created by stakeholders. And in a few projects, we also do policy optimization. So we use algorithms to determine policy portfolios that could, according to the simulations, perform well for that particular reality. And that's one of the things I will show also for the Brazilian case in one of the next slides. But before that, let's go back to a little bit more basic results before I go to policy optimization. So yeah. So one? We had, yes, this one. So we had in Brazil, across the 4 scenarios that I mentioned, we had, for instance, a big question mark on how much green hydrogen would create demand for renewable energy and create a market for renewable energy, and in the end, how would the share of renewable energy in the country evolve in each of these scenarios, right? So here you can see very clearly the contribution of green hydrogen, right? The blue line is a base case without any green hydrogen. The red line is the one that contains the investments that are already announced in the country in terms of new green hydrogen capacity. And then in green is the double scenario, and in black with the help also of more favorable fossil fuel prices, right? So you can see that the country can achieve a full renewable energy matrix by 2050 in some of these conditions, right? So this is a real important conclusion at the time. In the next slide, you see another indicator or some other indicators that we also simulated at the time, how consumption of fossil fuels would decline in each of the scenarios, how the capacity of each renewable generation source would evolve over time in each scenario, so on and so forth. Then the next slide, we see contribution in terms of climate change mitigation, in terms of the fraction of the total greenhouse emissions that we get to avoid in each scenario, and in terms of additional value added and the CO2 emissions per unit of value added, which is also known as decoupling, right? It's how much the country can increase its economic activity without increasing its emissions, right? So those are the types of analysis that we provided at the time. The report is available online. It's both in our website and in the Green Hydrogen Alliance website. Yes, next slide. Yes, so let me talk a little bit more about policy optimization, which is something that we don't do for all the countries, but for those who have a particular interest in that. So this is when we run the model, in this case 2,000 times, to be able to find policy scenarios that maximize the performance of the SDGs, right? So in this case, we took the scenario that was the black line in the previous graph, the strong ramp up with fossil fuel price increase. And we assumed that the projected debt to GDP ratio could not exceed 200% of two times the 2000 levels, right? Meaning it could not double compared to what we had in 2000, in the year 2000. And at the same time, the additional expenditure of any of the 28 policies that we tested could not exceed 1% of the country's GDP. So those were the limits that we put to this policy optimization exercise. And we're going to see the results in the next slide. Yes, so we ran it for 2 periods, one until 2040, because 2040 was an important milestone in some of the green hydrogen studies. And we saw that, for instance, investing in plethora of energy interventions, which is the yellow part of the pie there, as well as in climate adaptation, goes really well together with the green hydrogen subsidies that are expected for this period until 2040, right? So we managed to see the synergies here. We see that investing in, of course, renewable energy, it's quite straightforward why that synergizes well with green hydrogen, but then other areas that also synergize, such as climate adaptation, land protection, water, these are not so obvious, right? And then you see the synergies and you see unexpected combinations or unexpected portfolios that, according to our simulation model, would perform well in the country. And in our reports and presentations that we provide to our clients, we also explain why this happens, right? Yes, so that's up to 2040, and then in the period between 2040 and 2050, which is the next slide, we see.
Before we go to the next slide, since we have a lot of first comers here, would you mind explaining a little bit on what does it mean, the 3.5% per year?
Yes.
What does that mean as a percentage of GDP as well? I think that'll be interesting for people.
Yes. So in this scenario, which is an optimized scenario that proposes a new policy mix for Brazil, the government spending, the total government spending, would be 3.5% bigger in terms of percentage of the GDP compared to the current public spending in Brazil. So just for the sake of context, we have right now Brazil spends about 40% of its GDP in terms of government spending, right? So the ratio government spending per GDP is about 40%. In this scenario, it would increase an extra 3.5 percentage points, right? But it's important to say, Fernando, that we also simulate the dynamics of public debt, right? So if there is a financing crisis created by the policies that we simulate, we would also have seen it, and we wouldn't be proposing this scenario as the best alternative to maximize SDG performance, right? Because we have this feedback also in the model. We have the computation of the government deficit and government debt and the accumulation of debt and the cost of debt in the model. And that in the long run, in our simulations, can also compromise investment capacity and can also compromise the performance of the SDGs. In this case, this is not happening, right? Which means Brazil indeed has this capacity to spend a bit more in this area. It wouldn't face any problems in terms of finance, according to our simulations, right? In the next period, we see that what the policy optimization exercise suggests that Brazil could spend even more, right? It could spend an additional 7% of its GDP distributed across these areas that we are showing. And we see, for instance, one very interesting finding from this study is that maintaining roads seems to be a very high return on investment in Brazil, according to our simulations. And that's something that one might ask, but how does that synergize with green hydrogen, right? Turns out that the geographical distribution of development in Brazil is very uneven, and maintaining the road network working is something that, according to our simulations, has a very high ROI to take development to regions of Brazil that are usually underprivileged in that sense, including, but not only in the energy and food value chains, right? Because we see also in the food part of the graph on the top right, we see that agriculture training, fertilizer subsidies, and in general investment or subsidies to agriculture also play an important role in maintaining a higher performance in terms of sustainable development goals for Brazil when combined with energy and green hydrogen investments, right? So that's the summary of this. Yes, and here's the graph that shows the difference for each of the SDGs between the policy optimization that we did and the most optimistic scenario that we had already before, right? So you can see that there is quite an additional performance that can be achieved, especially in SDGs like SDG 11, SDG 2, SDG 14. You can see there's a lot of opportunity in Brazil to synergize these different policy areas and achieve an even higher performance in terms of the average SDG performance, which is the black bar on the right side. And that's something that normally is not obvious to the stakeholders who propose some sort of ambitious industrial policy like green hydrogen, right? They don't see the full picture. They just think they often think in terms of the economic output, the jobs that this will create, perhaps a little bit on the demand, the creation of demand for renewable energy, but that's where they stop their higher order thinking, right? And with our model, they can really see beyond these usual boundaries and look at broader impacts that they might be contributing to. Yes, I think, yeah, okay, there's still, some of the key policy areas that we see across all of this policy optimization exercise that deliver a lot of synergy when combined with green hydrogen. So climate adaptation, roads, as I said, and reforestation are some of the unusual combinations that yield interesting results in terms of increasing SDG performance. I guess that's pretty much what I had prepared, right, Fernando?
Yes, I think that's the last one. I have since there are a few people asking here in the chat about the demo sessions. You can schedule a time with one of our policy analysts here. Just go to millenniuminstitute.org. There's a button there to request a demo, and then you pick a time with one of our policy analysts, and then we can go in more detail. We can even simulate some scenarios and look into the model itself. And if then our policy analysts have some limited time, so if the schedule in our website doesn't work for you, just send us an email, and then we can find another time if any of those available time slots there doesn't work for you. Thank you, Igor. Sorry. Yeah, thank you, Igor, for presenting the results of the green hydrogen project and how it worked. Now I think we have a couple questions here in the Q&A. So I'd like to get started by answering. I also see some questions in the chat, so if you don't mind just pasting your question here in the Q&A so we don't lose the chance to answer your question. I'll start by answering the question from Detlef, and he's asking, does the model represent only one country or multiple countries together? And I can answer that. The model has been built to represent one country in the national level, but we do have some projects that have adapted the model to show in a regional setting. So it really depends on what the client expectation for one specific project and what kind of problem that you want to create a policy for. And maybe I move on to the next question here. Maybe Igor, this we can answer. If you don't have a full answer, but can at least try to answer. Lovely is asking, out of 3 years of study presentations at the Dynamics Conference, and I'm assuming it's the International System Dynamics Conference, I saw only one case where the model presenters had reconsidered the study's predictions with reality once it arrived, and it was qualitative study. Do you carry out this verification?
Yeah, indeed, back testing. This person's talking about back testing, right? Which is a practice that is common in some modeling traditions, but it's not so common in system dynamics. And the reason for that is that system dynamics doesn't have the ambition to predict the future, right? It has the ambition to explore different scenarios and show why each of them could play out in reality, right? So it's a different type of mindset. Then if the model gets it wrong, let's say, doesn't manage to predict the future within the context of one of the scenarios that was studied, then what the system dynamics modeler has then to do is try to ask the question why and constantly improve the model, right? So it's made to be an iterative process as well, learning from reality as it plays out and constantly improving the model. That's how it's supposed to be, according to the theory of system dynamics, right? The challenge that we have in reality is that when we do those trainings that Fernando mentioned in each of the countries we work in, often the people who take the training end up leaving their jobs or their government careers, and the human capital that should be there is to be able to update and learn from the modeling, right? Isn't there anymore. So that's one of the main challenges we have nowadays in our practice. So that's another piece of criticism that is often made to system dynamics, right? That it's too complicated to learn, and when the people actually learn it, they end up because the turnover rates are so high in these government institutions. They end up leaving, and all of this investment that was made ends up lost. So that's one of the main challenges that we had, and that relates to this question.
Thank you, Igor. I can help you answer the next question from Philip, and he is saying the En-ROADS. And for those who are not familiar with the En-ROADS, the En-ROADS is also a system dynamics model in a global level that simulates climate change. So you can go to Climate Interactive to learn a little bit more, and also even play with the model if you want to, if you're curious to know about this model. So the En-ROADS team is beginning to include the adverse economic impacts of global warming into their scenarios. Is MI doing something similar, and can you explain? So the model already has this impact of global warming. So we have impacts of global warming precipitation, for example, it definitely will affect eventually the agriculture production and yield. So it directly affecting the economic outcomes of a country. Igor, do you want to elaborate a little bit more?
Yes, we have some layers of, this aspect is computed in some different parts of the model. We have one more, let's say, high level computation that is done in terms of comparing the adaptation expenditure with the infrastructure, the needs for expenditure and infrastructure created by different climate scenarios. So it's a very straightforward computation that the model does. If the country doesn't invest enough in adaptation, the damage to infrastructure will then accumulate over time and create all sorts of problems in the country, right? That are then simulated in the model. So that's one way that we computed, but there are a few other things, like you said, in the agriculture aspect, in the energy computation. We also have, because a lot of countries are highly dependent on hydro, so we have this computed into the energy sector as well. Yeah. So this, in general, these are called damage functions, right? It's and yeah, we are constantly working to improve them, including in conversation with Climate Interactive, with whom we keep a constant dialogue. Yeah.
Thank you, Igor. We have here, I think, two more questions, one in the chat and another one in the Q&A. And the one in the chat from Bianca, she says, Haver Analytics. I'm not very familiar with them, but Haver Analytics has made huge strides in cleaning and organizing data from developing countries, and most importantly, making them comparable. Are you familiar with their work? Any reason why you don't use them? I personally am not familiar. Are you, Igor?
No, I didn't hear of them. Important to say, though, that we, among the many data sets that we use, there's only one that is paid, which is the IEA data, that we do have an IPI agreement with them. All the others are freely available, and that's something that we strive to keep, right? Because our goal is that each country can then update their own model using publicly available data. And our goal is also to keep our model replicable and repeatable, right? So that it can be scientifically assessed, right? So that's part of the reason we don't use this type of data sets from, data brokers or, there are many of them, but we try to avoid it as much as possible.
Thank you, Igor. I would also add that we do have a small team in the Millennium Institute that only works with data. And I would recommend that HAP Analytics for them so they can take a look as well. I saw a question here, sorry, in the chat. I'm just trying to look where it was. Meanwhile, I'll try to find that other question. There is one in the Q&A, Igor. What and how can we interact with the government if they have not got policies in place on SD?
Probably they mean sustainable development, right? Yeah. So we work with governments at different levels of maturity in their sustainable development journey, right? Sometimes the model is used precisely to evangelize other parts of the government on the advantages of investing in sustainable development, right? So sometimes our client in the government is, let's say, someone at the Ministry of Environment, or the environment person within the Ministry of Finance or within the Ministry of Economy, who's trying to convince their peers, right, that these are actually good investments and that they make sense for the country. So yeah, we do have projects with countries that are completely different levels of maturity there. What we see also very often is that there is a certain gap between a more pragmatic discourse and a more idealistic discourse. And sometimes what we try to do is to bridge that gap. For instance, countries that are still in the very beginning of their trajectory, some of the dominant narratives they have access to are about climate mitigation. But then those are narratives that are very hard to sell to, for instance, Minister of Finance, right? Because they don't see the damage functions that we've been talking about. And they know that climate is a global issue, right? So they know that investing in mitigation won't deliver any direct results to the country. So we have to show that some of these investments also have other consequences that are positives to other areas, other domains, so that they understand how these things are actually connected and cannot be treated in isolation.
Thank you, Igor. We are reaching our time here. Still have 2 minutes. Thank you, Christina, for your question. I see a final comment from Konstantin here in the chat. Is it possible, or do you already account for global trade performance in the simulations to understand the transition to sustainable energy systems or food security, especially for countries depending on trade, for both the energy and food, to align domestic objectives with international realities?
Yeah, what we do now in terms of food trade and energy trade, we do compute international trade, but from the perspective of that country that is being modeled, right? So we don't have a global model yet. It's something that we are working on. That would be then plugged into, like, that we could use as a host to all of our national models, and then do this cross-scale simulation, right? That we don't have yet, but we are working on that. And right now, yeah, we do compute food, international trade, import and exports, and energy as well, but from the perspective of that country that is being modeled. So then it varies over time, but according to demand and supply that is specific to that country, right?
Perfect. Well, thank you, Igor, and thank you everyone for joining us today. I think we had a really insightful session today. We are continuing to schedule these kind of sessions to, share a little bit more of the model and how it works, and give presentations about it, and the simulations and the scenario analysis, how working with the Millennium Institute goes. That's all from my side, Igor. Thank you again for joining me today. And if you receive now a link in your email, everyone will receive an email now with a link to schedule a demo session if you're interested in a one-to-one live session with one of our policy analysts, where you can ask more questions and dig more deep into the simulator. And some people also asked for the slides we presented today. I'll be sharing with everyone here today.
Thank you
so much. Obrigado.